Okay, welcome everyone this evening to the first MLE Friends talk of the fall 2023 season. As you know, the MLE Friends series is a series we've developed specifically for the MLE Friends community, and we feature each season at least 4 different speakers from a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds from the MLE community, so the MLE Association members and board members, and so it's one of the ways that we're able to share really the wealth of knowing and research and wisdom from our community. So we're really, really excited to have one of our newer association members this evening with us, Dr. Hanne Jaegher, whose work I think many of you know and love. At least I do. I really am looking forward to the talk this evening. And so I'd just like to briefly introduce Hanne, and then I will give her the floor to start her presentation. And then after the presentation, as you know, we'll have time for questions and discussions. So as questions come up for you, feel free to note them down, put them in the chat, or raise your hand during the discussion. So Hanne Jaegher is a philosopher and cognitive scientist, writer, researcher, and teacher. She's a leading developer of the enactive approach to intersubjectivity and conceived and elaborated the theory of participatory sense-making with Ezekiel Di Paolo. Participatory sense-making has since been tested and applied across a wide range of academic and applied disciplines, from neuroscience to the arts. Currently, Hanne is thinking about how loving and knowing relate to each other as existential tensions in human lives. She's proposed the enactive approach as an engaging epistemology, a perspective that interweaves knowing with being and doing and ethics with interaction. Her methodological innovations include the development with Barbara Piper of the prismatic approach. With Ezekiel Di Paolo and Elena Cuffari, she co-authored Linguistic Bodies in 2017 from MIT Press. Dr. Jaegher is co-director of Dialogica UK, a majority autistic-led social enterprise out of the UK that facilitates dialogues and provides coaching for autistic people, family members, and friends, as well as academic researchers. And so this evening, that leads us nicely into the topic of the talk, which is between theory and practice, enaction, and the caring professions. So Hanne will be walking us through some of her most recent ideas on this in-between space between theory and practice and how enaction can truly be applied in the world today. So thank you so much, Hanne, for offering your time and your wisdom with us, and I'm happy to give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Johanna, and thank you for inviting me to be here and to speak about this exciting topic. I will share my screen and yes. Okay. I still have a few of you on the screen as well. That's nice. Then I can see an audience. So yes, I will be talking about enaction and for the caring professions, because I think there's in a way a kind of going together as well as an interchange of expertise between enactive cognitive science and enactive philosophy and the caring professions. And I see that as a very thrilling direction that has already been going on in some ways, but also is you know, the trajectory or the common path that we're laying as we're walking it is developing, I think, in new ways in many different places, but also through my work on intersubjectivity. That's one part of it, I think. So, and the theme of Mind and Life this year and for the coming years is caring for life. And I think, of course, one aspect of that is caring for intersubjective life. And by intersubjective, I mean the widest possible understanding of how we live together, how we understand each other and ourselves and the world together through and with each other as we interact with each other in all kinds of sophisticated ways all over the place. So our intersubjective lives are also basic, I think, to our lives as human beings. And so caring for life and caring for intersubjective life are equally basic to what we care about, I think. And so, yeah, this is about, in a way, moving between cognitive sciences and philosophy and practice. And it'll become clearer what I mean by practice throughout the talk, because I will be referring to many things. But it's sort of a moving between enaction and active cognitive science as not just a theory, but also perhaps a worldview or even a way of living that is conceptual, experiential, and lived, for which there's a lot of scientific background and a lot of philosophical grounding. And then the caring professions. Here, I focus particularly on the caring professions, by which I mean medical professions, including doctors, nurses, also therapists of all different kinds, coaches, but similar things than what I'm saying here today can be applied as well to teaching, so to education in different ways. There are lots of similarities, although of course also each profession is specific. So I talk in general, but I will also hint at some specificities of different elements of what I'm talking about through examples. So moving between these, I don't know if even to call them fields, but areas of life in which we work, we can wonder, one question, and this is from a paper that's going to appear soon, is a question that Francisco Varela was asked towards the end of the 1990s, 1999, I think. He was asked by a publisher why cognitive science matters, and to give an answer that makes it clear to, as the publisher then said, the person on the metro. Why does cognitive science matter? And give an answer in a way that will tell people what, in general, in this people in the street or on the metro, what the relevance is of cognitive science for them. And then Varela thought about his connection with Buddhism and his studying Buddhism and Buddhist ways of understanding the world and life. And so he thought that cognitive science is moving towards a science of interbeing. But what is such a science of interbeing? And it's to do with our interconnectedness and the interconnectedness of everything. And so around the same time, Amy, you wrote with Francisco together, and also in some writings of your own, about ideas of transference related to your profession as a psychoanalyst, complexity, intrusion and welcoming, alterity and hospitality. And you mentioned in one of your papers that there was a way of thinking of Francisco Varela that connected to the world and to life in such a way that when you talked about it, there is a way in which what Varela's way of engaging with ideas brought is a sort of news of yourself to you. But in a way also, I think that what Varela's work was doing brought news of ourselves to cognitive scientists. And I think that's also one of the points you were making in your writings then, that this way of understanding can bring us news of ourselves as cognitive scientists. And that's quite a new thing in a way, because as scientists, we tend to keep ourselves away from what we are studying, and that's kind of safe. But if it brings news of ourselves, we change. And this is a very insightful and important element of what we are doing with enactive cognitive science and with enaction as a philosophy. And so in conjunction with this question of why cognitive science matters and what is it to you, everyone, the news of ourselves that it brings is important and an intriguing question in a way. So if cognitive science brings us news of ourselves, what is this news that it brings us? How are we doing cognitive science? And is it actually right the way we are doing it? You know, traditional cognitive science has tended to put people apart, to sort of box people in terms of a certain determination that we have of them from a theoretical approach, by which they then find it hard to interact. I will give some examples throughout the talk as well of this. But it's not only what news of ourselves does cognitive science bring the cognitive scientist, but also what news of ourselves does the cognitive scientist bring the people that it studies, its subjects in a way. And in my work, one of those groups of people that I'm familiar with, cognitive science bringing news of themselves, is autistic people. And the news that cognitive science has brought autistic people is actually limiting them in the way they can be in the world, and that's problematic. And with enactive cognitive science, we are contributing to changing that so that autistic people can participate with scientists when we are doing cognitive science. And this is not only happening, obviously, because enactive cognitive science is making these changes, but also people are just participating more, and rightly so. And so I would like to read a part of the new introduction to the embodied mind by Eleanor Roche, where she talks about this issue as well. So cognitive science, what is it to you? First, Evan Thompson in his new introduction also writes that his intention has always been to foster a new kind of wisdom, one rooted in a mature cognitive science that is deeply informed by experiential practices of ethical human transformation. So that's really part of this caring for intersubjective life, I think. And Eleanor Roche writes, for a real dialogue or a trialogue to occur, all sides need to speak and be heard equally. That has not happened yet for the topics we explore in the embodied mind, where science, as it is done now with its mechanistic and materialistic assumptions, meets experience, Buddhism, or anything else. The science simply takes over like a colonial ruler. This is body imperialism, not dialogue. It need not always be that way. There is also a quantity of goodwill being generated, and that could become fertile ground for a more responsive future. I think that's important in the whole work that we are all doing. We have offered Enaction as a form of science that may help bridge the communication gap between experience and science. It will not do this automatically. Ideas such as the lived body and Enaction can easily become merely a romanticization of the old paradigm of a corporeal form limited to self-survival and self-aggrandizement. On the other hand, still quoting Eleanor Roche, such ideas could be a transition to a new paradigm for what body and mind are all together. The key to progress is to keep an open mind, and while we are at it, it would not hurt to also have an open heart, she says, of cognitive science. And so we can wonder, what is it as a cognitive science to have an open mind and an open heart? So keep this in mind. So this is me now speaking from cognitive science, but then I will also speak, if you like, from the other side, namely care professions. And so often when I speak, when I give presentations, also when I see other people in our field giving presentations, I notice that care professionals come to us because they sense an affinity with Enaction, with the enactive approach, and they want more of it, they want to understand it better. And so, yeah, in a way, I think that's what we are working towards, and that's important. So what is this affinity with the enactive approach that care professionals sense? Why is it there? And also I sense that there's a kind of need for this enactive approach to support or ground or help care professionals understand what they are doing in a way that they both already know as humans, but also that they could use further theoretical and conceptual grounding for in order to support their approach, because traditional approaches in cognitive science don't support what they know as humans in their professional interactions. And this is, in a way, setting the stage for what the talk will be about. Investigating that human knowing that care professionals already have, but also could do with more of. So as an example, take a piece of research that investigated what physician caring is. And so this is a scoping review that was looking for definitions of physician caring or characterizations, which apparently there isn't yet one definition. I mean, maybe asking for one definition is also not the right way to go about it, because of course people will have different ideas of it. But they say after this review, there is not yet a strong theoretical empirical understanding of physician caring. And yet they have looked at what people say about physician caring, and they see through a thematic analysis 6 aspects, which are the relational aspect of caring, technical aspects of caring, the attitudes and characteristics of physicians, agency as understood both, I think, in the physician, but probably also in patients or clients, the reciprocity of it, and also important physician self-care. And of course, I think we can add material, social, institutional context of care provision, which modulate all these things or determine them in a certain way. And so they did this scoping review and think that this kind of understanding of physician caring is needed to develop an evidence-based approach to improve healthcare delivery, but also to potentially mitigate physician burnout. And this is also interesting, I think, because here are the 6 elements again in the middle there, physician caring. But they also hypothesize, and these are the dotted yellow lines, they hypothesize that these elements that they analyzed are related to the quality of care, so health outcomes for the patient, and also to physician outcomes. So it's related to how a physician can be a professional and can be a good physician, is related to all these elements of the relations, the technical aspects, their own self-care, the reciprocity, and so on, and also this lack of a definition or a good understanding. So one of the things they point to is that there is a certain moral injury that physicians can have, and that relates to whether they can do their profession well, whether they can care well in their understanding and context for being a physician. And when they cannot do that well, this gives them a moral injury, and that leads to burnout. So we know more generally, perhaps, that it's important for patients to have a good understanding of care, and that care involves everything, not just meeting targets or something like that, but it's also important for physicians themselves. And that it's a moral injury, I think, is very interesting, because it means that something is hurt in the person when you cannot, in the professional as well, when you cannot care well. And so this is I think this paints a very complex picture where I think Enaction can contribute quite a lot. So let's get into some of the elements of what that can be. Oh yeah, what I wanted to point out is as well, and this will be a theme that runs through the whole presentation, is that there are, if you like, always, I will be looking at this issue through the lens of intersubjectivity, and that includes 3 elements. And the elements are, to take it in a model kind of sense, an interaction between 2 people. So it's each person, a patient and a professional, or a client and a professional, and the relation between them. And these 3 elements always interact with each other in complex ways. So that will be coming back throughout the presentation. So we can wonder about physician caring, if it's put in this box where there isn't yet such a good understanding of caring, how a physician meets a client or a patient. And they might do that through something like the DSM-5, with a particular categorization of mental health disorders and diagnostic criteria. And this provides a kind of box through which to look at a patient. But this box may set the patient apart in particular ways and make it difficult for them to actually interact. I will give some examples through autism a bit later. So how does this physician caring work, whether we use diagnostic paradigms or not? The kind of boxology that happens, or that can happen, in ways in which physicians and care professionals are still often trained. And if we take an enactive approach, we look at this interaction differently. So we look at what each person brings in terms of what they care about, but also how they meet each other and see each other, whether it's through a diagnostic manual or also as a person and so on, as human beings involved with each other. And can we, as physicians or care professionals, allow ourselves to be humanly involved with our patients or not? What kind of balancing do we do in these interactions? And how does that relate to our own professional proficiency, if you like? And of course, in enactive terms, we also look at what happens in interactions between people on many different levels and how all these things relate to each other. So I will go in some more detail about all this, because we can conceptualize it through the enactive approach as the basics of participatory sense making. which is how we literally participate in each other's sense-making, because each of us are self-maintaining, self-organizing systems who interact with the world, or systems, maybe beings is a better word, how we interact with the world and regulate these interactions, and how then when we meet each other, something emerges between us, which is an interactive process that we participate in and get pulled up in, that has its own autonomy, and therefore co-determines how we participate in it. And for people who are new to this, maybe most of you aren't, but I will still give a kind of introduction to these ideas in some more detail. And I will do that in order to present Enaction as a kind of framework for conceptualizing, empirically studying, and supporting professional care. And it's all to do with, of course, intersubjectivity and how we participate in each other's sense-making together. And so for care professionals, if you're a care professional listening to this presentation, I think what is important is that these elements of intersubjectivity or participatory sense-making include that we are all full bodily beings in situations. So we are embodied and we are situated, and this is always the case. We are never just an autistic person or a person with Tourette's. That's a kind of abstraction. We are always bodily beings here and now. And for the beings that we are, always something is at stake, something matters. And we can ask, to whom does this matter, and why and how? And these are basic questions in this approach. And then the other important basic elements is our relationships and interactions and their dynamics and experience. So all of this makes for a very complex picture, which if you're not used to it as a care professional, say, or if you're new to the enactive approach, may look maybe overwhelming to engage with all of that. But that's why we are proposing the theories of intersubjectivity and sense-making and participatory sense-making in the enactive approach to sort of give some lived logic and structure to this, by which we can engage with it as full human beings and have some way of understanding it that might be helpful. So enactive cognitive science, starting with the paradigmatic text, The Embodied Mind, and also the whole history that goes into that, and the relations all over the world with Buddhism and so on, that crystallize this work in that book, and then in other writings, for instance, by Evan Thompson. Within that approach, we proposed the concept of participatory sense-making in 2007 with Ezequiel Di Paolo. And so the point of departure for this approach are two basic elements, which are the dynamics and the autonomy of the interaction process as it emerges between us, and the emergent identities of interactors, participants in interactions. So these could be care professionals and clients or patients. Their identities emerge in and through these interactive processes. So already there's a kind of shift here, not so much of identifying a person as being such and such, but rather when we interact here in this particular situation, we will be pulled up in this interaction and co-defined in a way. So for instance, whether you call someone a patient or a client is already one way in which these interactive processes and our co-determination of each other makes a difference to how we can participate. So that's already part of that complexity. And so from these points of departure, we move towards understanding how sense-making and participation are affected by interactive dynamics, and also then how we develop as individuals in this social context. And so with regard to care professions, how can we be present as individuals with our different roles in this social context that is brought up by how we conceive of our professional care relation? From all aspects, like patients and clients also conceive of these interactions and participate in different ways. So to go into a little bit more detail of the basics here, on the one hand, people, participants are sense makers, and on the other hand, the definition of social interaction. So we participate in each other's sense making on the basis of these two basic pillars, if you like. So in terms of the individual, first, the participant. Individuals are sense makers, and that means that things matter for them. Things are at stake for sense makers, they care about what they are doing all the time. This relates to Spinoza's term of the conatus and of concern. We have because we are living, self-organizing bodily beings, we have needs and constraints that are directly related to or are ingrained or stem from our bodily self-organization and what we need for the particular bodies that we are. And this gives a perspective on the world to us. And from that perspective, certain things are relevant, others are less relevant, some we can just ignore or don't even see. And this is depending on the particular bodies that we are. And so this happens at different levels of identity. So as a doctor and patient interacting, we speak and interact and provide for each other different things than we do, for instance, when we speak with family members. And so at different levels of identity, we are maintaining ourselves in our interactions, and we do certain things and avoid doing other things in relation to these identities that we maintain in particular situations. And so sense-making is always a relational process of signification between a self-organizing agent and their world. So we don't like make sense of something over there through some kind of presupposed elements that we have in our brain or in our cognition, but we make sense of ourselves and of each other by interacting in the world. And so here's this diagram again of self-organizing. So the two inner circles there are the way we are sort of an abstraction of how we are self-organizing beings, and it comes from Maturana and Varela's work in the Tree of Knowledge. But also we regulate these interactions with the world. So we are not just impinged by what happens, but also we have, as human beings for sure, and also animals do this, we regulate our interactions with the world as well. So there's always a kind of tension or a balancing between meeting the world and the world impinging on us. And this is like a coupling or an interaction that we don't have always choice in, but we also at the same time have a capacity to regulate this. And so this is always going on when you meet an individual in a certain situation, such as in a care relation. And what is also important about this is to understand that this self-organization is always precarious. We're always balancing being able to sustain ourselves in these different ways. And here we see some extreme examples of this in the person walking a tightrope. But really, life is always a bit like that. We are always like maybe at the boundary of falling off of what we're doing. Especially, I think lately, many people are quite. At least I am, but I know that many people are on the verge of being way overwhelmed by what we are doing, but also what the world is like at the moment and so on. So we're always, and I think we sense this, falling off the rope. It's always there, that thread. And so that characterizes life in general. And so this self-organization represented here by that circle is always a precarious thing. It's something that we need to take care of what kind of things we take in. If we are overwhelmed and stressed, we need to maybe eat well and take in good things in order to make sure our self-organization keeps happening. And this is an everyday way of saying it, but in enactive research, of course, there's a lot of investigation of what that requires in very detailed ways. So the self-organization is always precarious. And because of this precariousness and the vulnerability, things are significant for us in a way that relates directly to our very existence. So our self-organization or our existence, our continual capacities for becoming and being are directly impacted by how we relate to the world. And so a basic question also, not just for enactive cognitive scientists, but also for care professionals, I would say, what is at stake for this person in this moment based on their self-organization, based on their way of being in the world, on their particular bodies. And so, for instance, to give an example, because I realize it's a bit abstract what I'm saying, in terms of autism, for instance, there are proposals that autistic people have a particular way of rhythmically engaging at a sensory motor level with their world, so that when an autistic person might be doing something strange, such as rocking back and forth, or maybe looking through their fingers at something while they move their hands quickly in front of them, we may characterize that as stimming, and perhaps in old-fashioned approaches to autism or unhelpful approaches, that kind of behavior is understood as something to be treated away because it looks undesirable or strange, and it's not understood, and it looks like meaningless behavior. And so some approaches want to just treat it away and get rid of it. But actually, when you think about it from the experience of an autistic person, and you understand that there's a particular embodiment for autistic people, then this behavior might actually be meaningful and be helping the person self-organize and continually exist. If, for instance, their sensory motor coordination with the world is quicker or slower in some elements, and they need to slow the world down by looking at it through their fast-moving fingers. So all of these levels of identity of our sensory motor self-organization, how we interact with the world, and so on, are to do with how we maintain ourselves, and so our very basic bodily existence. And they show up as behaviors, which sometimes only make sense if you understand the full picture of how a person is bodily organized. And it's important to keep this in mind. And so there are particular differences between people in all these ways of interacting with the world and maintaining our existence and self-organization. So also for a physician or a care professional, if, as we saw earlier with the issue of moral injury, if a care professional is not able to do their profession well because of institutional constraints, for instance, about meeting targets, then they cannot care well, and their existence, their identity as a care professional is threatened. And that leads to this moral injury and burnout. So that relates to their existence and their continuing being and becoming as a care professional. And if that's hurt, that has impact on their possibilities. And the same goes for patients or clients. If I can't be myself, my existence is threatened, and this plays a role in how I will be treated. And so one other example of this is in the case of Tourette's. Tourette's is often immediately seen as, there are tics, and they are sometimes very remarkable, or they I only have now the Dutch words. they jump out at us as being strange, and they can be shocking. And so that is like an attractor for understanding Tourette syndrome. But if you understand tics and Tourettic experience from the way we engage with someone who has Tourette's through interviews and so on, we can understand their experience of being or having Tourette's. And then when you investigate that deeply, as Jo Barefoots and Diana Belliars, whom we wrote a paper about letting Tourette's be, they investigated the everyday experience of Tourettic people. And they noticed that Tourette's is a kind of response to the world when it becomes too intense or when it's not just right. And so that's what the picture is referring to. It's a person holding a sharp kind of crystal in their house while they're cleaning. And something about the situation is not just right. And so they press their finger into the crystal, and that gives a sensory experience that helps put the world to right again. And this then is a kind of compulsive acting around this object, but it's not just a tic, it's a way for the person to make it so that the world has balance again for them. And this relates again to their self-organization as a bodily being, and how they can make it so that interacting in the world is smoother again for them. And understanding this lived experience is really crucial, I think, to let everybody be how they are and become as best they can from their own possibilities and constraints and needs of interacting. Another example is in the case of stroke patients, for instance. There is a way in which what happens after stroke requires physicians and teams of carers around the person to gives precise care about, which is very involved, and precise moments of the temporal course of rehabilitation. And so precise physiological care is needed at certain moments. And sometimes that overrides the understanding that a patient is a full participant in this course of the trajectory of rehabilitation. And this can sometimes be applied, the care can be applied in such a way that it forgoes the patient's participation. They feel like sometimes an object on an assembly line, rather than considered to be someone who is also trying to understand what's happening and so on. So caring happens at several different levels, and what we can do more of, perhaps, or what we can investigate between the enactive approach and care professionals, is how this self-organization and levels of identity in patients and in care professionals can relate to each other better, so that we can all be and become with more nuance, as everybody deserves. So that's the individual aspect of the basics of participatory sense making. On the other hand, there is also the interaction process, as I said before already, which can take people up. And this is because it takes on a life of its own, if you like, or a certain autonomy. And this can be scientifically analyzed and researched in many different ways, and it has been done as well. But a way to, and we have a definition of it as well, but you can look that up if you need more. The two conditions for an interaction to be social is that there is a co-regulated mutual coupling that leads to temporary autonomy of the interaction process. So it takes over and pulls you up, if you like. And at the same time, the autonomy of interactors, of participants, cannot be destroyed in the process, so that they have to remain able to participate. And their autonomy can increase or decrease as they interact. Here, I've given this example often, so many of you are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, here it is again. So here you see, we give this clip from North by Northwest as an illustration of this interactive process emerging and then taking over what an individual was intending to do. So here's Cary Grant running away from the police, and here he gets picked up by an interaction process. In a way, he gets picked up by Eve-Marie Saint as well, but also something emerges between them that makes now that he has to do something else rather than keep running through the train. He gets picked up by this interaction process beyond his own intentions. And of course, in the film, it's all much more complicated than this. But the illustration is that interaction processes can pick us up and change our intentions. So they have quite an influence in how we understand each other. And we can measure and show these interaction dynamics on many different levels. So this happens physiologically below our awareness. It's well known and researched that, for instance, in something like improvised music therapy, people regulate or synchronize their breathing rhythms. And this has then an influence on how well therapy goes. But also we coordinate words that we use together. And this is shown on many, many different levels. And so the interaction process takes on a life of its own. In a way, then we can say that the interaction process as such, so not just only our own individual sense makings, co-determine our cognition, how we interact, how we participate, and our roles and moves and possibilities when we meet each other. So this includes our roles as care professionals or as patients and as clients. So we are contending with these interaction processes, if you like. And so here's another more abstract representation of it. We have agency, for instance, as a care professional. And if we use, say, the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, how does that then influence our interactions with our patients or not, or with our clients? So these things make a difference in how we interact and how we can meet each other, therefore. And that influence how we can continue becoming, which is a goal, of course, of care professions, to make it so that people in their continuing, ongoing becoming can do that as best as possible in relation to their own being already. And often, or sometimes, something like a DSM manual can restrict someone's becoming, although there's lots of nuanced discussion about that as well. Maybe we can go into it in the discussion later as well. Johanna, can I ask you, I have not got a clock in front of me, and I don't know how I'm doing with time.
No problem. Take your time. It's 6:43 right now, so take as much time as you need.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, there's still a bit to go. So yeah, I'm going to deepen these ideas a little bit more yet. So in terms of the basic of participatory sense making, like I said before, we literally participate in each other's sense making, and this is because of our own self-organization, needs and constraints that are related to our very bodily, material, sensory, motor, immunological, and so on being, and how we meet the world, regulate our interactions with the world. And when we meet the world, it's not just the world or an other, someone different from us that we meet, but also the processes that emerge between us in terms of interactions determine us as well. So it's a very complex picture in a way that we contend with also and in care contexts. And so participatory sense-making is this sense-making in the context of a social interaction. It is how people understand each other and how they understand and act on the world together. And it's affected by these coordination patterns, breakdowns, and recoveries that happen during social encounters. And so if we take the lesson from this part, which is about the life or autonomy of the interaction process, how does it develop in this situation between a physician and a care professional and a client or patient, depending on what kind of approach we take to this interaction? Yeah, what kind of school of thought we follow, whether it's the DSM-4 or another school of understanding our own profession in which we are trained. So in a way, I mean, if you just look at it in terms of the mechanics of dynamics in interacting with each other, of our own self-organization and the self-organization of the interaction process, this can still be understood sort of mechanically, but there's a deepening of the theory, which I think is relevant here, which is how it helps us care for becoming and participating. And I've mentioned this already throughout this introduction. And this deepening of the understanding of participatory sense-making, I've conceptualized through proposing that loving and knowing are similar, so that how we know each other, also I think that's in care professional interactions, we are continually engaged in knowing our patients, in knowing our own professional roles. And this deeply existential relation that is, I think we can understand through thinking that it's like loving, or understanding that it's like loving. And this centrally evolves around this idea or a problem or thing that we do, which is letting each other be. And letting each other be is letting things be. This problem of letting things be comes from Kim McLaren's work, and also has roots in Heidegger's work and other people, where we can let each other be in ways that are either helpful or not for the continual becoming of each of us. So if we, for instance, Kim gives the example of a horse trainer who is just interested in training the horse and winning contests and making money with the horse, and overtraining the horse and making it actually lose its capacities or lose its being as an animal that also likes to roam and play and be outside and be a horse rather than just this contest winner. And so when we do that kind of interacting with another being, we forgo their existence and forgo their capacities of becoming as themselves. And so there's a tension in this about letting someone or another person or the world be, that we know very well in the tension of letting others be. And Kim McLaren brings this back to an argument based on Merleau-Ponty's notions of intercorporeality and intersubjectivity, which are about how we share a bodily world and act on things through others, as well as we mutually situate ourselves and each other over against each other. So letting others be and letting ourselves be is always an active project of engaging with their being without foregoing it, without over-determining it, and also making sure that our own being is not foregone or bypassed by this interaction that we are in. And it'll become a bit more concrete in a few more examples later on. So I'm proposing a different epistemology on the basis of letting phenomena be, which is always in interaction with how I know them as a particular person, so as a cognitive scientist or as a physician or as a coach or a therapist. I know my patients or my subjects in cognitive science always in a way unavoidably that changes them. And we have to be careful with how we intervene, because we have no choice but to intervene in who we interact with, because we always are building each other through interacting with each other. We are co-determining each other. And so phenomena are never just out there. They are part of us and we are part of them. And this is the kind of caring that I'm calling for here, that we do that in a careful interaction. And so this idea of letting be is never just, is never actually a disengagement or an over-determining. It's rather an engaging interaction. It's always letting be is not letting something be over there on its own and letting go of it. It's rather an engagement that allows the other and myself both to be and become how we are, and to be aware that we both continually change and our relation changes continually as well. And I think this is quite relevant and basic to care professions. And my point is not that enactive theory provides a theory that care professionals should take and learn. I think that actually it would serve us well as enactive cognitive scientists and philosophers to really interact with care professionals and learn from them, because that's where the practice is and the practical understanding of these processes. So I think really that it's in the interaction and the engagement with each other that we can all learn more of this. And so to explain this idea a little bit more about loving and knowing and letting be, I think one of the points is that we know this dynamic of letting each other be and how difficult and tensionful that is in our loving relationships. So love relationships, whether it's between parents and children or between friends or between lovers, or loving relationships are a quintessential place where we all find and live these dynamics of this kind of non-detached but rather engaging knowing, which is the inherent tension of being yourself as in different situations. So this also applies in the situation of being a physician, for instance, being yourself and being in relation, and the relation pulling on you as well as the being of the other and your own developing understanding of how your work goes. And so this is all related also to an inherent tension of recognition. When we recognize an other, this also means something about ourselves in a certain way. It tells us things about ourselves as well. And so what love can illuminate about sense making is this deep involvement that we have as the beings that we are, whether it's as a full human or as a professional in a certain field. We have an involvement in the people that we are interacting with, those we understand or are knowing or are in the process of knowing. And only if we understand this involvement of ourselves as we are and as we can continually become, then we properly understand human knowing. But paradoxically, in a way, we have this human knowing. We are already, all of us, experts in this human knowing. And yet, often in our professional relations, whether it's as scientists or as carers, this human knowing, this aspect, this existential aspect in loving is something that we have to set aside, or at least we feel we have to set it aside in order to be professional. But as we saw in the beginning, if we do that, this might lead to moral injury and burnout, because there's an element of this sophistication of relating that we feel we have to leave out of our relationships. And this is part of what I'm pointing to with this development of ideas. So this loving or engaged epistemology has a paradigm case in love relationships. And it's always a matter of understanding the interactive and individual self-organizations and normativities at play, to go back to the terms used in enactive cognitive science in terms of sense making. And so there are limits of knowing. This is not just, it's talking about loving doesn't make it a rosy picture. In fact, it's really about tensions between over and under determining. So if you take the example of a physician using the DSM-5 in order to diagnose a person with autism, a person might need this diagnosis in order to be able to get accommodations at work, say, and for that it's handy, and the patient or the client can be determined in a way that helps them become in their further life, so that they can move on in ways that are good for them. If they need a diagnosis and can then get accommodations at work, that's in a way a helpful determination. But in another way, the way that the diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 are made for autism might also be an overdetermination of an autistic person, because according to that diagnosis, autistic people are having lack of capacities in social interacting. And that kind of the diagnosis then sets people apart as unable to interact well, and therefore unable to participate sometimes with doctors. And so this is an example of overdetermination by which an autistic person might feel, actually, okay, I have a diagnosis now, that's helpful. But on the other hand, this diagnosis also makes it impossible for me to interact, apparently, when I know that I can actually interact and have quite sophisticated senses of connection with other people. And so it's always a balancing of this over and under determination of people as they let each other be, in ways that are supportive of their ongoing becoming and participation. So this is just a summary of the loving and knowing or engaging epistemology. So when we think about loving and knowing or these kinds of interactions as being between over and under determination and then apply it to care professions, the question is how to do or support or understand care in caring professions, so that all these three elements, the client or patient, the professional, and their relation can be let be, so that they can have a good ongoing becoming and participation. So in the example of autism, for instance, in early development for autistic children who maybe in the beginning or maybe always don't speak or don't have communication as neurotypical people tend to easily recognize it, there are approaches that start early, very much from where the child is in that moment. And an example of such an approach is intensive interaction, developed by Phoebe Caldwell, where when she interacts with a child who other people might find really hard to make a connection with, what she will do is a form of intensive interaction, she calls it, which is basically being present with the child in the room when maybe the child is having a meltdown or being overwhelmed. And when Phoebe just sits with the child in the room and starts slowly moving with the child, maybe in ways that imitate what the child is doing, or finding a same level of making sounds at the same level of intensity, or the same level of I can't find the word now, the height of the sound that the child is making. So joining the child or the person where they are, and that's a form of recognition that's very, if you like, basic, out of which then more sophisticated interactions can emerge. But I think this is a very clear case of intending to let a person be and inviting or coming to a sort of interaction, not by over-determining this child is unable to communicate, but rather, how can I be present with this child where it is, and then let something emerge between us from there. And then this provides a good way of becoming and participation that makes that possible rather than determines it as impossible through something like diagnostic criteria for autism, which set autistic people apart as unable to communicate. You see that that's the kind of balancing that I think is helpful. We can also, this also is shown between autistic adults, where, for instance, researchers in Edinburgh have shown that, contrary to also traditional theories of autism, actually autistic people find their interactions very rich and satisfying when it is with other autistic people. And it's being shown that there's a lot more fluency in autistic interactions, as much as in interactions between neurotypical or non-autistic people. The fluency is equally high, but where it's difficult is where there are interactions between neurotypicals and autistic people. And so that's, in a way, what Damien Milton was pointing to with this double empathy problem. It's not just that it's not that autistic people don't have empathy, it's more that also neurotypical or non-autistic people trying to understand autistic people also lack empathy for this particular difference. And so a lot of the research in the autism field is actually counteracting this overdetermination that has happened for a long time in approaches to autism. And some of my work at Dialogica, which is an organization out of the UK, as was mentioned in the introduction, and what we do there is we use the autism dialogue approach developed by Johnny Drury, who is here present this evening as well. And Kate Zelinsky is also present in the audience here. We work together to bring this dialogue approach where we understand autism in this way of being together and understanding each other that is not over-determining, but rather letting each other be in dialogues. And so in the dialogues that we hold, which are based on professional dialogue approach, one of the things really concretely that came out of this dialogue series that we have is that there is a preference for autistic people in a dialogue, in a circle of dialogue, to leave some silence after one person speaks, so that everybody has time to process what is being said and also has time to come into the dialogue and begin participating. And after we found this out, we noticed actually that neurotypicals also quite like this, and that it's helpful for neurotypicals as well to have space through silence in a dialogue. So these are different levels in which this letting be can work. So the main points of the presentation are that we are all intersubjective experts for being humans. We have intersubjective expertise as care professionals, as cognitive scientists, as humans in general. And at the same time, there are many reasons why we could do with yet becoming better at it. And so I think one of the crucial messages that I would like you to maybe take from this is that at some level, what we all share is that we all care. For all of us, things matter, always, all the time, just from being these self-organizing living beings in the world, situated as we are. So we share this mattering and caring. Where we differ is in what specifically matters to each of us on a given day, in a given situation, in a given interaction. And so this specificity of what matters sometimes comes out in particular patterns of differences that are more often clustered together, for instance, throughout neurodiversity. We are all neurologically diverse. We have differently wired brains, differently wired bodily beings, and different particular forms of neurodiversity emerge, for instance, in autism or in Tourette's, that require particular forms of care, geared to this particular difference, but also each time recognizing each person as their own specific person to whom particular things matter in each interaction. So this conceptual work and the lived experience come together in participatory sense-making and loving and knowing. And I've worked on several elements of this in different areas. I just flagged this here, but I realize also that the talk has been going on for quite a while. So I'm going to come to the conclusions. There are three elements always at play: who each of us is as we meet each other and the interaction between us. We are all intersubjective experts and can learn more. We can deepen this expertise, especially also in the caring professions. And the enactive approach provides a conceptual and lived experience framework to regain or to gain trust and confidence in our human intersubjective expertise. And this is through the enactive lived logic of how we make sense of the world, through sense making together and with each other. And I think this is in the end about how we can live well or better together. And I think what can make a difference to your practice if you're a care professional is this knowing that we all care, that we share that, and that what we care about is different for each of us, and that we can approach, sort of have a level of relating in terms of, yes, you also care about something, but what you care about is different than what I care about. And if there are problems for which I'm called in as a care professional, let's look at all these levels of caring and difference, with the goal of improving or aiding your becoming ongoingly through and after this care relation that we have. And so one lesson is also that responsibility for all this is in part extraneous to individuals. It's not just our full individual responsibility to box each other away as this or that kind of person, through something like perhaps a DSM-5 approach, a diagnostic manual approach. The risk of that is that we set each other apart too much. But responsibility, being in part extraneous to us and in part relegated to the interaction processes that happen between us, means that we have to take care of, not that we can let go of taking responsibility, but that responsibility requires taking care of our ongoing becoming and participation through understanding the roles that interaction processes take, and through understanding differences in each other in a careful way. And it is when people are put in boxes by each other, for instance, by an overdetermining approach, that communication and care and interaction become unnecessarily difficult and can lead to injustice and discrimination. And that is something that we should fight against, and which we are, many of us, doing in different ways through our work. And so it is this traditional training and conception of care professions that invites this kind of boxology, also of our relationships. And this is what we fight against. But because we live in this world in which this kind of boxology is very present, under and overdetermination of each other are unavoidable. And these basic dynamics of interacting with each other are characterized by boxologies, by putting each other away in different ways. We cannot avoid that. That does happen. So what we can do is to be aware of them and to learn to move better through them so that we can truly care for each other and ourselves as care professionals and the world together. And this, I think, is one way or to go for caring for intersubjective life. And that is the end.
Wow, thank you so much, Hanne. That was beyond rich. I think rich is maybe an understatement. And I'm looking forward to hearing from people in the audience in the Zoom room, what reflections come up, what ideas come up, what questions come up. So the floor is really open for discussion now. So don't be shy. You can either post something in the chat or just raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself, and we'll just have a nice free-flowing discussion for about a half an hour with Hanne. So Lara, you mentioned you had a question, and also I see Martina after you.
Yes, thank you very much, Hanne. Really amazing, so rich and deep. So many things I would like to explore further, but I have one question, so I address this one. So yes, I think that a fundamental thing that you say is that participatory sense making is made of me, you, and the interactive processes. So they are three, right? And the interactive processes have a life of their own, so they are autonomous, right? And I think that this is crucial also because sometimes that there are these debate around atmospheres or something objective, and these help us to see how instead they are relational, that they are always changing. But I'm thinking at a situation in which it seems that really they are objective in a manner, or in a way that they are fixed, are structured that we cannot change, right? So this may be when we fix them or we freeze them. I don't know. I have in mind situations in which maybe there are some power dynamics. I don't know. I can be talking with someone else and we are in a very patriarchal structure, right? Or hierarchical. There is kind of dimension of structural violence there that is really embodied also in ways of behaving, habits, roles, etc., etc. So my question is, we know that they are alive, these interactive processes. Still, there are situations in which they are objectified and in a way they become dead, fixed, freezed. So what could we do in order to make them alive again, in order that they can be really having their autonomy and evolve and transform and we can contribute to them? So it's quite a practical question.
Yes, quite a practical question. Thank you. And also a question with many, many layers in the question and also in the response, I think. So yeah, I totally agree. So this is another element, I think, in a way. So these kind of atmospheres, or it's in a way, yes, we can enter a situation in which, for instance, there is a power dynamic already at work with a long history that we cannot change, but we fall into in some way. That happens regularly. I mean, the world is full of it, and we are not always aware of it. Especially when we're used to being in a dominant position, for instance, in power relationships, that makes us unaware of it. So one of the things, and then we fall into a way of interacting and don't notice that we fall into this way of interacting. And from a dominant position, it's then easy to hurt other people and not be aware of it. So that's one of these kinds of dynamics that goes on that I think you're pointing to and that will be recognizable to many people. And so taking that example, one way to deal with it is as a general, all of us humanity, to become more aware of it. But that's of course an abstract thing. We know that that this kind of dynamic is changed by people meeting people who are different from them in particular ways. So meeting across genders, meeting across neurodiversity, and meeting across places of origin, meeting across skin color. All of this makes us more aware of it. But I think we also can invite particular, and maybe should do more of that, but I don't really know how to do that, more diverse interactions across diversity. But that's only one way, because it's not always a matter of just bringing in more diverse people in a room, because that still doesn't really address, for instance, microaggressions that can happen between people. So increasing awareness, yeah. I don't really know what else to suggest. I mean, in the Prisma work that we're doing, the Prisma workshops, which you can look up on the website if you're interested, it's prismamethod.net. We bring people together in interactions where they can experience the precise localized dynamics of what happens when two people interact with each other in a specific situation, and then you sense these dynamics at work, and also how you can begin to modulate them. But I really think it's a matter of global awareness, and also awareness as an individual of what it's like to be pulled into these particular dynamics. And once you become aware of how these dynamics here and now between us in this interaction work, this awareness can begin to give you options to change it. So I think at a global and very local level, we can work on increasing awareness with then possibilities to change participation. But it's a really important, enormous question, actually, which I don't have many answers to yet. Yeah.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you, Hanne. It kind of gets to the heart of it all. So you kind of started us off really strongly. So I think Martina was next. You mentioned you had a question in the chat. Why don't you unmute yourself if you're able to?
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks, Hanne, for the very interesting talk. And my question is about the participatory sense making in care practices, basically. And it's about the involvement in these practices of robots. Because as you for sure will know, in this kind of practices, it's really becoming really common to have also this kind of artificial helpers that really try to make the interaction smoother, or that trying to also I don't know, like engaging with, for instance, autistic people or people in the spectrum in particular manners that may be even more efficient in, for instance, developing social skills, and also for people with Alzheimer's disease that maybe can be trained with cognitive activities with these robots. So my question would be, but of course, these interactions not always have the outcomes that we predicted, for instance. So maybe the interaction is not really an interaction sometimes. It's more an object-subject interaction, it's not subject-subject interaction. So my question would be, can we analyze this kind of different interaction in which also these kind of agents are involved? With participatory sense making, because of course we cannot really describe the interaction between a human and the robot as participatory sense making, because the robot is not an autonomous agent, and it's not a autopoietic agent, so it's not really an organism. But then it seems that something like participation is real in interaction. So what is your idea about that?
Yeah, that's also a really big question. Thanks. As you said yourself, between robots and humans, this participatory interaction cannot emerge, because a robot is not an autonomous interactor with care. They don't care. There's no caring behind it. And if they seem to care because they tell certain things or do certain things, they seem to convey values. It's values that are put in by a designer. And so it's very important that a designer of a robot puts in the right kinds of care that are actually adjusted to the person they are supposed to care for, and not over-determining the person in that way by having a specific understanding of who they are caring for and maybe doing an injustice to them. So so the design of those things should be very carefully done. But then also I think their use is very limited, because precisely no participation can emerge between them. And you also mentioned something about making the interaction smoother and gaining efficiency, for instance, in teaching social skills. But I think making interactions smoother is actually a distraction and something that could be dangerous, because what actually makes up human interactions, or what's really, I think, basic to them and something that we shouldn't do away with, is that it's full of frictions and breakdowns. And so making interactions or understanding of each other or someone's behavior smoother actually does away with what they need in order to live and to make sense of the world. So the enactive approach, and very clearly in Francisco Varela's work, shows that breakdowns are basic to living sense making. So we need breakdowns, we need friction in order to keep moving, in order to keep being ourselves, in order to become as we are, and in order to understand each other. And so taking that away is a distraction and potentially a danger. And through robots, that might be one goal, but actually it's not good for human becoming. And so robots, I think, should be used in perhaps completely menial things like doing the dishes, but not interacting with the person. Yeah. Thank you for the question. And it helps to put some of the implications clearer, I think.
Thanks for the response. Thanks.
And also I thought of something else in reaction to Laura's question. I think actually also for people in dominant groups, we need to listen and just be silent and listen. That's also one of the big things, shut up and listen, actually, to, in situations of domination like patriarchal systems, sexism and racism and all those things. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think there was also a related comment to Martina's question from Johnny during in the chat. Yeah, same with drugs or any other devices. I think he was following up on the interactions with robots. So I think our next question was from Ruben. You had your hand raised for a while.
Thank you, Hanne, for this very interesting talk. I just was thinking many of the themes, this relates to Laura's question as well. I was thinking care often takes place not only within life worlds, but also within systems. And then you have, as Laura was saying, structures of domination and so on. And I was wondering whether a notion like democracy, so like bringing in political philosophy, could be helpful. And I'm just wondering whether the enactive approach could be extended not only to this life world level, but also to a more systemic level, where you have discussions about democracy. And like the political theorist who has worked a lot on this, it's called Joanne Toronto. She has a book called Caring Democracy, which I think it resonates a lot with what you're saying. But it would be interesting to see this enactive approach, how it could extend beyond the life world. But yeah, very, really interesting work. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
It was more a comment than a question.
I'll take it as such. And also, yes, I think it's an important direction, but I don't have much to say. But thank you for that reference and for that point. Caring democracy, yes.
Thanks, Ruben. And I think we'll move to Oana.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk. Extremely interesting. I have a question related to what my work is in the field of democracy. So when I heard you, Ruben, saying what you just said, it just resonates to me. But my question would be you said talking about robots, you said that interaction implies caring. So I was wondering, because we see all over in the world all kind of interactions where caring is not present. So I was wondering when we talk about interactions, we are talking about caring, or there's another way to mention this kind of relationship that is, I will say, unfortunately, present all over in our lives, where caring is not present. For example, in the relationship that citizens have with dominant structures, people in government that have the authority to make decisions, even against, or usually against the well-being of citizens. So are we talking about interactions, or are we talking about other, do we use another concept instead of interaction when caring is not present?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, that's important. Also, so I think that if I did say interaction implies caring, that's not what I meant. I think living beings cannot but care, and always something is at stake for them. So when we come to an interaction, each of us differently, we care about something. Something is at stake for us. Something matters to us. But interactions, even though they develop between us and emerge between us, they have an autonomy, they pull us up or push us out, they do things with our participation, but they don't care. Interactions as such, these emergent processes don't care. That's human beings who do that. And human beings make sense of each other. And yet, as Laura already pointed out and is kind of a current through the comments, pre-coordinated situations that we end up in, for instance, in certain political systems, in social media, set up ways for us to interact with each other that make it more or less possible for us to come with all that matters to us. And so I was thinking that maybe you had in mind also social media, where people put forward something they care about, they just propound it, and another person propounds their opinion, but because of the way the system is set up for us to interact, we cannot actually engage and transgress and transform each other through better understanding how each of us cares. As you can see, I'm not so up on the political philosophy, so I'm not responding to that aspect of your question. It's not my expertise, but I do. It's not, interactions don't care. They have ways of self-maintaining and ways of pulling people in, determining their participation. But systems do care in some way, maybe, like overarching systems have values that they bring into how we can then interaction or not. I mean, that's a whole other level of complexity that is totally worth investigating and is being investigated in political and social science. So that's another bridge to build with enactive theory. That's very important. Yeah, and totally impinging on this discussion. I think that's really good that that comes out here because it's important. Yeah. It's not a satisfying answer, I know.
No. My field of research is adult education. So I'm working with radical adult educators that encounter citizens coming from poor neighborhoods, and they try to put them together to organize them and be able to confront the authorities, the dominant power. So I'm very interested in the relationship that those organizers have with citizens and how they can address that interaction in a caring way. Mm-hmm. So, but now I understand a little bit better when you say interactions don't care. Yeah.
So I think a starting point also for the interactions you're talking about is for everybody to understand that for everybody things matter and things are at stake. So for the people that they meet, things are at stake. And what precisely is at stake? What is the need here? What is the constraint? And how does the constraint and the need and the capacities maybe that people have, how do they meet what is provided by the providers? And are these the correct provisions for the needs that are there? And how can we move whatever can be moved in this situation so that people can be better met? I mean, I'm sure that people work like that. But it's not, I'm always surprised, that in education, in this kind of care work that you're talking about, political work, in care professions, we don't actually start from that things matter to each of us. So this idea that we have developed in the world, that we have to have a preconceived understanding of what's going on theoretically, abstractly, objectively, and then we impose it on the world, and then we're going to make things better. I mean, yeah, it's still surprising that that's so dominant, and yet it is. So what is the need in humans behind understanding things in this way? And which needs are being served by doing this? And then it's clear to see what's being served is the status quo, maintaining the status quo, maintaining dominant structures, maintaining structures of dominance. So then we have to fight on that. But there's a need and a care behind that itself too. And once we understand that and see it, maybe that also opens up possibilities for changing it. It's a need to dominate in some sense, often, I think. And there's fear behind that for sure as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, and lots of tensions, I will say, lots of dilemmas also.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
So before we move to you, Petra, I just wanted to make sure that Anne had posted just I think a clarifying question earlier in the chat about the third entity in the trilog and what that was in your configuration. Hanne, if you want to respond to that.
Yeah. So yes, the third entity is the interaction as it emerges between us, the interactive process. Yeah. And how as it influences us.
Thank you.
Okay, so I think we have time for just one more question. So Petra, why don't you go for it?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Hanne, for this talk. It's really interesting. I have a lot of questions, but I will focus on one. I'm also working on participatory sense making as a spatial designer, and the intersubjectivity and bodily knowing of all the people concerned is just what situations we are constantly working with. So I wonder if you also worked on tools or methods how to reach that encounter in which creates a positive transformation for everybody involved. Being without a setting which from the beginning is intended, what I hear about in care professions or in teaching. I'm also teaching, and actually being in a teaching context is a far more protective situation than working out in the field where there are real power games going on. And to my experience, there are ways of fostering interaction which can become qualitative for collective sense making. But there are also settings which pivot into the opposite direction. I wonder if you have some insights on how to orchestrate that the interaction can become more fruitful and to prevent collapse.
Wow, another big question. I think one of the things I'm thinking about is being mindful and installing some kind of mindfulness or awareness from all of us as we interact, or inviting that. So the dialogues that we do with the autism dialogue approach often start with a sort of centering of or mindfulness for each participant. And of course, in MLE, that's a very central practice as well, and something that's investigated and so on. So that's an important element, I think, so that we open up space and time for awareness of all of us, and therefore sensitivity to ourselves and to each other. But that's a very general, I mean, it's a general and at the same time completely specific proposal or approach that people take already. Other than that, I'm not really sure, because I think you mentioned spatial design and the material world. It's not really my field of expertise at all, but I imagine that as you work to design spaces, you try things out and bring people in and see where they go, see the paths that they lay down while they walk, things like that. There must be principles of that.
But for instance, we observed that in a collective setting, if we begin with everybody presenting themselves with their role, interaction does not happen creatively. because everybody feels obliged afterwards to represent what they announced who they are. So now, for instance, one way of delaying and opening up other perspectives for projecting individually into a situation is that we first create an exchange on another subject, and the representation the person has in public realm only comes in later, if at all. And by changing the priority, this, for instance, is something which now we know is crucial, because if we begin an interaction where a person says, well, I am so and so, I'm the mayor of this town, nothing new will happen. Everybody will reinforce preconceived ideas of what should be said and thought.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that's an example of people putting themselves in a box, which they then have to defend right from the get-go. Exactly. And then no interaction evolves. So that's a great finding.
And similar observations we also made, for instance, on how to organize people in space in relation to each other, to what you mentioned by installing some pause before responding, and providing actually several channels where a person can respond to, that the person can choose on which level to respond.
Nice.
That also helps.
Yeah.
And I wonder actually if you have some findings on your side to compare with.
There might be. I can't really think of one at the moment immediately, but sort of yeah, I like definitely that people can respond that people are given a few different channels to respond is great, because then they already can act in the way that is coming from themselves more than from an imposed proposal of how to do things here. It gives people more options and possibilities of remaining with who they are, and therefore making more likely a kind of bridging between each other.
Yeah.
And I think also, yes, in some research, I remember in some design research where somebody designed a process, a way to bring participatory sense making into collective decision making. So actually democratic processes, which is the researchers Filemone Jasma from the Netherlands. She developed a great system. And one of the points which you also mentioned is that people are around a table and there are tokens on the table with symbols on them, which can represent something, but people can make up what they represent. But having the possibility to interact using the token is a kind of how do you call it when you relay thunder by putting a stake out, so that
lightning conductor,
but it takes it away from potentially dangerous things in such an interactive situation, because you don't have to be invested with your own representation, but you can put it on the token. So then it's easier to talk about difficult issues. It came out of her research, and you're saying the same thing.
Yeah, actually, I did similar research with providing alternative interaction structures, like going into game settings to provide momentarily parallel in roles where another form of interaction is experiential. Yeah,
that's really nice. Another way to bring in people into a dialogue could also be to give them a way to introduce what is at stake for them or what matters to them, rather than this is my role. What is occupying you right now in relation to the question we will be discussing? What is your worry or your concern or your hope? Or might be another option, which is maybe something you've tried or done.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Petra, and thank you, Hanne. And I think we're well over our time, so I think we'll close the evening there. And all of our thanks once again, Hanne, for this really important, I think, timely talk too, because it seems to be on so many people's minds, and it's brought up so many questions that are clearly emergent and will need to be discussed more. So look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you again, Hanne, for your talk.
Thank you, all of you as well, for your really rich questions and comments. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. And for those of us who'd like to join us for our next couple of online events that'll be open to the public on YouTube, we have the next 2 sessions of the Core Enaction program, which is our online course at Mind and Life Europe, where we're doing a close reading of the second half of the embodied mind. So a lot of what we discussed today in Hanne's presentation will be dug into in the foundational text of the enactive approach, which is the embodied mind. And so we'll have Dr. Valérie Bonardel, who'll be presenting on chapter 8 on October 11th. And then we'll have a good colleague of Hanne de Jaegher's, Ezekiel Di Paolo, who'll be presenting on chapter 9 on October 25th. So both of them really are not to be missed, because they're 2 people who are deeply, deeply embedded in enactive thinking and studied under and even knew Francisco Varela. So these should be really interesting talks coming up. So thanks everyone for joining us, and have a really nice rest of your evening or day.
Thanks for that.
Hanne. Thanks to Hanne.
Thanks.